We're going to scan the country and really the world for reaction on the life of Colin Powell. With us now on the phone, Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday. And Chris, thanks for getting up and joining us today and your reflections on the life of Colin Powell and his contribution to America.
Well, I think, like a lot of people, when I saw it come across email today that Colin Powell was dead, I had a gasp. And I think he was one of those timeless figures. I heard Dana earlier say a giant that you just didn't think of as his passing from the scene. I first got to know him when he was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the Reagan White House, then became National Security Advisor. I've been thinking back over the many memories I have of him really for almost 40 years now. And I think the highlight, which were touched on by David Spunt, the highlight of his career when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in early 1990s, 1991, and headed the military operation along with Secretary of Defense Cheney to push Saddam Hussein back out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. And, he, along with Norman Schwarzkopf and Cheney and George H.W. Bush, built up this huge international coalition and began it with a months-long air war that just pounded Iraqi forces, and eventually then launched that left hook, a ground invasion into Kuwait against the Iraqis, and forced them back. That was clearly the highlight of his career. As David mentioned, I think the low light of his career was in 2003 when he addressed the United Nations and made the case that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He did not want to make that speech. And he took a lot of pressure from people in the Bush 43 White House, including Vice President Cheney, who was reported to have said, look, you got high approval ratings. You can use a few of those points to sell the war. He was very skeptical of the case and actually went out to the CIA and was briefed on it and asked questions and was not thrilled about it, but got given orders by his boss, President Bush, and Vice President Cheney, and spoke before the UN. And, of course, most of what he said about Saddam Hussein having chemical and biological weapons turned out not to be true. And he took that very personally. He was very protective, understandably so, of his reputation, of his integrity. And he said for years later that this was a stain on his career, and he very much regretted making that speech.
Chris, what I remember from that 18 years ago is he virtually spent the weekend. It was 3 or 4 days locked in a room with George Tenet listening to the evidence. And it was after the conclusion of that several-day meeting behind closed doors that he agreed to go before the UN. And you're right about the stain. He called it a blot that will always be a part of my record. But it was the credibility of Colin Powell at the UN that really sold America on the offensive nature that was to come in this military action, Chris.
Yeah, there was a source, supposedly a secret Iraqi source that the CIA had developed with the apt code name Curveball. And a lot of the intelligence was based on what Curveball was telling CIA operatives, and it turned out not to be true. But, this certainly was, as you say, a blot in his campaign and in his career, and something he felt badly about. But that shouldn't define Colin Powell. There are two stories that I very much want to tell and immediately thought when I heard about his passing. One was, here's this black Jamaican kid. He and his family, they moved to the United States. He lives in the South Bronx, and he ends up working as a kid for some Eastern European Jews who ran a furniture store up there. And he learned Yiddish from these Eastern European Jews. So at various points when they'd be negotiating with people about what the price would be for something, the owners would go into the back room, and the people inside, the customers, would be there with this little black kid, and they would start talking to each other in Jewish, not realizing that Colin Powell understood everything that they were saying, and he'd go back and tell the owners, his bosses, exactly what they were saying in terms of negotiating for the price. He used to tell that story with tremendous delight, and in fact, in his adult years was quite fluent in Jewish. The other is, and I think this was colored by the fact that he had served in Vietnam, and like a lot of American military people, saw what happens when the military and the leaders in Washington get ahead of the public. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the early 90s, he developed what was known as the Powell Doctrine. And the Powell Doctrine was really two things. One, that if you were going to fight a war, you fought with overwhelming force. You didn't go incrementally, as we did in Vietnam, that you brought everything there was to bear, and which, of course, was what we did in the case of Iraq in 1991 with Desert Storm. And the second thing is that you had to have American public opinion. You couldn't fight a war successfully in a democracy if you didn't have the public behind you. And that was something that very much guided him in that war and in his feelings about U.S. military campaigns after that.
Chris, it's Dana. I wanted to ask maybe a little bit more on the political side of things, because he had thought about running for president under the Republican Party. He was roundly, warmly welcomed at the Republican convention. He decided not to run for various reasons. We could talk about those, but also then his politics changed over time, as I guess many people's have. He endorsed President Obama and then President Biden.
Yeah, it is interesting. In 1996, there was a real draft movement to get him, obviously not in 1992 because George H.W. Bush was going to run for re-election, but in 96 that he would be the Republican candidate opposing Bill Clinton in his re-election effort. And there was a very powerful draft campaign. Coincidentally, I was at ABC at the time, and the bosses said to me, if he runs, you're going to cover Colin Powell's campaign. And everybody thought he was going to be in. There was a real big push, and finally, in the end, he decided not to. And one of the reasons, and I suspect you were alluding to this, is that his wife, Alma, and they were so much a team and loved each other so deeply, was quite concerned about an African-American running and the possibility that he would be attacked physically as an assassination. And that was one of the things, and she was very, very nervous and concerned about that. And was one of the reasons he decided at the last minute to back out. As you say, he was a loyal Republican. He served as Secretary of State to George W. Bush from 2001 to 2005, the entire first term. But as time went on, and this was a tough one because in 2008, John McCain was the Republican nominee, and they obviously had close ties, and he had contributed money to McCain's campaign. But late in the 2008 campaign, he decided to back Barack Obama, which was a big deal at that time, a Republican like Colin Powell backing the Democratic candidate, and talked about him as the first serious African-American candidate, that he would be a transformational figure.
Chris, thank you. Thank you for reflecting and your thoughts on the life of Colin Powell.
And your knowledge is so helpful as we try to tell this story this morning, Chris. Thank you.